For years, a billionaire claimed his only son was born with a rare neurological condition that left him completely non-verbal. The child never spoke a single word in public, not at school, not at home, not even with doctors. Everyone believed the story. But everything changed the day the family's longtime housemaid, the only person who truly cared for the boy, was suddenly and publicly accused of stealing a confidential medical document. What happened next shocked the entire courtroom and the world. The boy opened his mouth and finally spoke, not out of fear, but to reveal the truth his father had tried to bury for years. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Campbell, one of the richest men in the country, stood in front of a group of reporters and cameras. His voice was calm but firm. He told the world that his son, Ethan, was born with a rare condition that made him deaf and unable to speak. Richard said that there was hope, a new experimental therapy in the United States that could help Ethan hear and talk. But there was a problem. A key document that would unlock the funds for the treatment was being held up in court. Richard begged for help. He said this was not about money or power. It was about saving his son's future. The moment was emotional. People across the country watched the news and felt moved by his words. Richard looked tired, but determined. He stood beside his lawyer, Vanessa Moore, who had been working hard on the case. Her face was serious as she promised they were doing everything possible to get the document released. Vanessa Moore, Richard's lawyer, had been working around the clock. She talked to judges, filed urgent requests, and contacted people in high places. Every day, she faced legal obstacles, but she didn't give up. She explained to the court that the research fund, which had millions of dollars, was meant exactly for cases like Ethan's. But because of a legal dispute involving the organization that controlled the fund, no money could be released without the confidential document. Vanessa argued that this delay could cost Ethan his chance at a normal life. She made it clear that time was running out. The therapy was only available for a short period, and Ethan needed to begin soon. Journalists followed her every move. News channels showed her walking into court with piles of papers, doing interviews, and speaking with passion. People online began supporting her and calling her a hero. But despite her strong efforts, the legal battle was more complicated than anyone expected. Inside Richard's large, quiet mansion, the mood was very different. While the world saw a desperate father and a brave lawyer, someone else was quietly watching everything. Grace, the housekeeper, had worked for the Campbell family for many years. She knew the house well, and she saw things no one else did. Grace cleaned the rooms, made meals, and took care of Ethan when Richard was away. She noticed how Ethan behaved. He didn't cry. He didn't make noise. He only sat in silence or stared at the floor. Sometimes he looked at his father with fear. Grace also saw how Richard and Vanessa spoke when no one else was around. Their voices were lower, more serious. They seemed nervous and sometimes even angry. Something about the way they acted made her feel uneasy. Grace began to wonder if the story they were telling the public was the full truth. She felt torn between staying quiet and asking questions she wasn't sure she should ask. As the days passed, the pressure grew. Richard did more interviews. He appeared on morning shows, visited hospitals, and even talked to government officials. He said that all he wanted was to help his son. Every appearance was carefully planned. Ethan was never shown on camera, but Richard always mentioned him. He talked about how Ethan used to smile as a baby and how this condition took away his voice. But Grace, who spent most of her time in the house, noticed things that didn't match what Richard said. Ethan rarely smiled. He avoided his father and only seemed calm when Grace was nearby. Once Grace overheard Richard shouting on the phone. He was angry and told someone to stick to the plan. Another time, Vanessa left a folder on the kitchen table by mistake. Grace saw pictures inside that didn't make sense. They weren't medical files. They looked like contracts and legal agreements with names she didn't recognize. Despite the rising public support, the court still hadn't released the document. Vanessa kept pushing, filing appeals, and asking for emergency sessions. She said the case wasn't just about Ethan. It was about giving hope to other families in similar situations. Her arguments were strong, but the judge remained cautious. Too many legal questions surrounded the fund. In private, Vanessa seemed more stressed than before. She barely slept, and when she did talk to Richard, they argued more often. Grace began to feel anxious. Something felt wrong. She wondered if the boy was really going to get the therapy or if something else was going on. She thought about speaking up, but who would believe her? She was just a housekeeper. Still, the more she saw, the more convinced she became that Ethan was not the only one in danger. Grace started keeping notes of what she saw and heard, unsure of what she would do with them. One night, while Ethan was asleep and the house was quiet, Grace stood near the hallway outside Richard's office. The door was slightly open, and she could hear Richard and Vanessa talking. Their voices were low, but she heard enough. They were discussing how long they could keep the story going and what to do if the document was never released. Vanessa said they needed more time. Richard said people were asking too many questions. Then there was a pause. Richard asked if Grace had seen anything. Vanessa said she didn't think so, but they should be careful. Grace stepped away quietly, her heart beating fast. She now knew something was being hidden. She didn't have all the answers, but she was sure the truth was different from what was being shown on TV. As she returned to her room, she looked back once more at Ethan's bedroom door. The boy was still silent. Nothing had changed, at least not yet. The day had finally come. After weeks of legal work, public attention, and emotional interviews, Richard Campbell was supposed to present the confidential document to the court. It was the final step to unlock the money from the research fund and send Ethan to the United States for the experimental therapy. But when Richard arrived at the courthouse that morning, he looked completely different. He was pale, sweating, and shaking. Everyone could tell something was wrong. As cameras flashed and reporters asked questions, Richard raised his hands and said the document was gone. He said it had disappeared from his home office during the night. The entire courtroom was in shock. His lawyer, Vanessa Moore, looked confused and angry. Richard didn't wait long before making a serious claim. He said Grace, the housekeeper, had stolen the document. He explained that she had recently argued with Vanessa and might have done it for revenge. The accusation caught everyone off guard. Grace was called into a private room and questioned by security. She was completely surprised by the accusation. Her face showed confusion and fear. She said she had no idea what Richard was talking about and denied everything. She explained that she had been working all night, cleaning the guest rooms and preparing meals, just like always. Vanessa stood nearby and said nothing for a long time. When she finally spoke, she supported Richard's accusation, saying Grace had acted strangely over the past few days. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing. People in the courthouse started whispering. Some thought she was innocent, but others believed the powerful man and his lawyer. With no physical evidence and under pressure from Richard, the judge ordered that Grace be temporarily removed from the house until further notice. She was told to stay away from the family. As she left, Ethan stood silently near the hallway. He watched her go, his eyes following her with quiet focus. Ethan didn't say a word, just like always. He stood next to a chair, holding his stuffed bear tightly. Everyone thought he didn't understand what was happening. Richard patted his shoulder and told reporters that Ethan was confused and scared, and that they would do everything to protect him. But later, back at the house, Ethan went to his room alone. He sat on the floor, still quiet. After a few minutes, he looked around carefully and pulled something from under his bed. It was a folded paper, held tightly in his small hands. His eyes studied it for a moment, and then he placed it inside a box of toys. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. But something in the way he moved showed calmness, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. No one else in the house saw him. Downstairs, the adults were arguing. The police had been called, and the investigation had officially started. The police arrived later that afternoon. They wore plain clothes and asked to see the office where the document was last seen. Richard led them in, explaining that he kept the paper inside a locked drawer. He said the drawer was found open that morning and the document was missing. The officers took pictures, looked for fingerprints, and asked many questions. Grace had already been sent away, but they said they would still need to speak with her again. Vanessa told the officers that Grace had been acting jealous and angry since the beginning of the legal battle, and had even made small threats. Richard repeated that Grace might have done it to hurt him or Vanessa. The police did not say much. They took notes, collected items from the room, and promised to return. Vanessa later demanded that the court act fast. She reminded the judge that the therapy Ethan needed had a short medical window and could not wait much longer. The judge held a short emergency session and listened to Vanessa's request. After discussing the case with both lawyers and the investigators, the judge decided to give 30 more days to find the document. He said the court needed proof, and without the document, no funds could be released. Vanessa looked upset, but she agreed. Richard nodded but looked frustrated. Reporters outside the courtroom gave updates to the public. The story of the missing paper and the accusation against the housekeeper made headlines. Some people defended Grace online, saying the accusation felt strange. Others believed Richard because of his fame and money. At home, the mood changed. Everyone was stressed. Vanessa worked late every night. Richard barely spoke to the staff. Ethan continued to stay in his room, quiet and alone. But inside that room, he wasn't just playing or sleeping. He was listening. When people passed his door and spoke, he looked at them, trying to understand every word. As the days passed, Ethan started to change. He followed people with his eyes more often. He watched their mouths as they spoke, like he was studying how they moved. Sometimes he even repeated small movements with his lips when no one was watching. Vanessa noticed that he sat closer during phone calls and stared at her face while she talked. Once, she turned and asked if he needed something, but he looked away quickly. Richard didn't notice much, too busy calling lawyers and dealing with the public fallout, but Ethan was becoming more aware. He began to sit near the stairs when people were talking downstairs. He watched, waited, and remembered. And always, the box of toys in his room stayed closed, hidden in the same spot. Inside it, the folded document remained untouched. No one knew that the paper they were all fighting over was in the same house the whole time. Ethan, silent as ever, understood more than they all thought. Every morning, like clockwork, Richard walked into Ethan's room, carrying a small brown bottle and a spoon. The liquid inside smelled bitter, and Ethan always frowned when he saw it. Richard said the drops were medicine for his neurological condition. He explained again and again that without it, Ethan could get worse, that it was necessary for his brain to stay stable. Richard insisted on giving it himself, never letting anyone else handle the bottle. Even the nurse who visited the house sometimes was told to stay out of it. Ethan sat quietly while his father poured the drops into the spoon. He opened his mouth and swallowed them because that was what he had always done. But something about the routine felt strange to him. The way Richard held the bottle so tightly, the way he never let anyone look at the label, all of it made Ethan uncomfortable. Yet he stayed silent, just as he always had. Grace, who had been ordered to stay away from the house, still tried to reach Ethan. She sent small messages through a neighbor, asking how he was. She even left a toy at the gate one afternoon, but Richard had it thrown away. He said she had no right to contact them anymore. Grace worried about Ethan constantly. She had cared for him for years and knew his habits better than anyone. She sensed something was wrong, but had no proof. Vanessa also noticed Richard's control over the medicine, but she said nothing. She was too focused on the court case and the missing document. Ethan felt the absence of Grace deeply. Without her presence, he became more quiet and closed off. He stayed in his room longer, drawing on scraps of paper and staring at the walls. He thought about the medicine a lot. Why did it make him feel so heavy and tired after every dose? One morning, Ethan decided he didn't want to take the medicine anymore. When Richard came with the spoon, Ethan opened his mouth as usual but didn't swallow. He held the liquid on his tongue until his father left the room. Then he spat it into a tissue and threw it behind the dresser. He did this again the next day and the next, pretending to obey but secretly refusing. Nobody noticed. Richard believed his son was still taking the drops. Ethan kept his plan quiet. As the days passed, he began to feel different. His head felt lighter. The constant fog that surrounded his thoughts started to lift. He noticed small things he hadn't before. The ticking of the clock, the sound of footsteps in the hall, even the distant noise of cars outside. These sounds were faint but real. Ethan didn't know what was happening, but it scared and excited him at the same time. He told no one. Soon the faint sounds became clearer. Ethan could hear whispers through the walls. He heard people laughing downstairs. He even heard Vanessa's voice during phone calls when she thought he was asleep. At first, he thought it was some kind of magic or dream. He had never heard sounds before, at least not like this. He sat still for long minutes, listening carefully, trying to understand. Sometimes the sounds made him happy. Other times they frightened him, especially when Richard spoke angrily on the phone. Ethan wondered if anyone else knew, but he didn't dare say a word. If his father found out, he might be angry or take away the medicine completely. Ethan began to realize that the drops might not have been helping him at all. Maybe they had been keeping him from hearing. The thought stayed in his mind like a secret. He didn't know who to trust with it. Days went by, and Ethan's confidence in his suspicion grew. The more time passed without the medicine, the stronger his hearing became. He could now hear the front door open and close. He could hear Vanessa typing on her laptop. He even heard Richard and Vanessa talking late at night about court deadlines and Grace. The words weren't always clear, but he understood enough to know they were hiding things. Ethan started to feel a mix of fear and curiosity. What if his condition wasn't something he was born with? What if it was created? He remembered how Grace had once told him quietly, "Someday you will know the truth." Now he wondered what she had meant. He also wondered why his father was so strict about the medicine. Was it really for his health, or was it for something else entirely? The question grew bigger in his head each day. Ethan didn't talk to anyone about what was happening. He stayed quiet, pretending nothing had changed. But inside, he was different. He had begun to watch Richard closely whenever the bottle of medicine appeared. He noticed how his father's hands trembled slightly when he poured the drops. He noticed how Vanessa never looked at the bottle directly. Ethan also remembered Grace's worried face the last time he had seen her. All the pieces started to fit together in his young mind. The medicine wasn't making him better. It had been keeping him the same, maybe even making him sick. The idea scared him, but also gave him a sense of control he had never felt before. Now he knew he had a choice. He could keep pretending and learn more, or he could tell someone. For now, he chose silence, holding his secret while listening to the world he was finally beginning to hear. Every night, after the house became quiet and the lights went out, Ethan listened. At first, it had been soft noises, chairs moving, footsteps, or the hum of the refrigerator. But now, everything was much clearer. The walls of the mansion were not as thick as they looked. Voices traveled through them, especially at night, when everything else was silent. Ethan began to hear conversations from downstairs, near Richard's office and the living room. The doors were often left slightly open, and the sound carried up the hallway into Ethan's room. He lay still in bed, eyes open, trying to catch every word. It became his new routine. Each night, after pretending to sleep, he would sit quietly and wait for the voices. And they always came. Richard and Vanessa talked late, thinking Ethan was asleep. They never knew he could hear them, and slowly Ethan started to not just hear. He began to understand what they were saying. At first, the conversations didn't make much sense. They spoke about money, court meetings, and strange legal terms. But after several nights, Ethan started to connect the words. Richard once said something about funds finally being unlocked. Another night, Vanessa talked about transfers to an offshore account. The words confused him, but he could tell these things were not part of his treatment or recovery. They weren't about helping him. Something was wrong. Then one night, he heard something that scared him deeply. Vanessa's voice was calm but cold. She said, "If this boy starts talking, we lose everything." Ethan froze. He sat in his bed, holding his knees, heart pounding. What did that mean? Why would them losing everything depend on him staying silent? He didn't move for a long time after that. He stared at the wall, breathing quietly. He finally understood that the medicine, the control, the lies, it was all connected. And now, he knew too much. Ethan didn't tell anyone. He was still afraid. If Vanessa and Richard were hiding something, and they knew he was listening, they might try to stop him. He wasn't sure what they would do, but the thought of it kept him silent. Still, he couldn't pretend nothing was happening. He needed to do something. One morning, while cleaning out his toy chest, he found an old plastic recorder. It was small, red, and had 2 buttons, play and record. It still worked. The batteries were weak, but functional. He tested it by recording himself humming and playing it back. The sound was scratchy, but clear enough. From that day forward, he kept the recorder hidden in his room. At night, he placed it near the door, under a pile of books, and pressed record. Then he waited. The voices came again, clear and serious, and the recorder captured everything. Ethan listened the next day, over and over to be sure. He learned to be careful. Each morning he hid the recorder behind his dresser or in the closet. He labeled the tapes with numbers using tiny stickers so no one would notice. He started collecting them, one each night. The tapes filled with bits and pieces of the truth. He heard Vanessa say things like, "We just need 30 more days, and he's only a child, no one will believe him." Richard once muttered, "We've come too far to stop now." They never spoke directly about Ethan's condition, but the way they talked made it clear. They needed him to stay silent, weak, and unable to speak. The whole situation wasn't just about money for therapy. It was about control, and maybe even fraud. Ethan didn't understand everything, but he knew enough to see that these 2 adults were hiding something very serious. Still, he couldn't take the risk of telling anyone. Not yet. He had to wait and watch. Ethan also started collecting small objects just in case. A flashlight, extra batteries, a tiny notebook, and even a copy of the house key Grace had left behind in a drawer months ago. He kept them all under a loose floorboard beneath his bed. He didn't know why he felt the need to prepare, but it gave him a sense of control. For the first time in his life, he wasn't completely helpless. During the day, he pretended nothing was different. He stayed quiet, played with his toys, and followed routines. At night, he recorded everything. The more he heard, the more he realized that the adults in charge of his life were not trying to help him. They were trying to use him. Every time Vanessa mentioned the court, or Richard whispered about what happens if this leaks, Ethan felt more sure of it. He knew he couldn't stop them yet, but he could gather the truth, piece by piece. The house remained calm on the outside. No one noticed what Ethan was doing. Richard still gave updates to the media. Vanessa still rushed in and out of the house with court papers and phone calls. But in Ethan's room, something important was happening. A child they all thought was broken was now listening, thinking, and planning. The voices in the dark, once scary and confusing, had become useful. They were giving him the truth, the kind he could hold on to, even if he couldn't say it out loud. Every night he listened more carefully. Every day he organized his notes and tapes in secret. He didn't know when or how, but he believed the moment would come when he would need this evidence. For now he had to be patient. He couldn't speak yet, but he could hear everything. And deep inside, Ethan understood one thing clearly. The truth was getting closer, and it was far more dangerous than anyone realized. The court had finally allowed a supervised visit. Grace was granted 30 minutes to see Ethan after several weeks of being kept away. A social worker accompanied her to the mansion, where Richard and Vanessa stayed out of sight. Ethan waited in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch. When Grace entered, his face changed. He didn't smile, but his eyes brightened. She sat down gently beside him, unsure how he would react. After a moment of silence, Ethan leaned toward her. He opened his mouth slowly and made a sound. It was rough and quiet, but it was a word. Grace froze. He said, "Grace," almost like a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears, but before she could speak, Ethan held a finger to his lips. He didn't want anyone else to hear. Grace nodded. Something important was happening. For the first time, Ethan was choosing to speak. He trusted her. She leaned closer. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. As the visit continued, Ethan quietly led Grace up the stairs to his room. The social worker allowed them privacy since the mansion was being monitored. Once inside, Ethan knelt beside his bed and pulled up a loose floorboard. Grace watched closely, not sure what he was doing. From the space beneath, he removed a small plastic box. Inside were batteries, papers, and a red toy recorder. He handed it to her. She looked confused, but then Ethan pointed to the play button. She pressed it. Static filled the air, then voices, Richard and Vanessa. The words weren't clear at first, but as she listened to more clips, it became obvious. There were phrases about money, lies, and keeping Ethan silent. One recording had Vanessa saying, "If he talks, we lose everything." Grace felt a chill. She looked at Ethan. He nodded slowly, showing her more tapes. The sound quality wasn't perfect, but the message was clear. Something terrible had been hidden. Grace knew she couldn't just run to the police yet. These recordings were important, but they needed stronger proof. Ethan's health had always been a mystery to her. She remembered how, over the years, his condition never seemed to improve, no matter how many doctors were involved. She suspected something, but never imagined it could be this serious. She reached out to an old friend, Dr. Leonard Hayes, a quiet man who had worked with the family long ago. She trusted him. Grace explained the situation without naming names and asked if he could examine Ethan discreetly. He agreed to meet them at a nearby clinic after arranging the paperwork. A few days later, Grace and Ethan met Dr. Hayes in secret. He performed a full checkup, including neurological tests, hearing exams, and blood work. Ethan stayed calm during all of it. He didn't speak much, but he followed instructions well. After the appointment, Dr. Hayes said he'd call soon with results. 2 days later, Grace answered the phone. Dr. Hayes was on the other end, and his tone was serious. He asked her to sit down. Then he said something she would never forget. Ethan was never disabled. She didn't understand at first. He repeated it, slowly, explaining the results. Ethan's hearing was normal. His brain functioned normally too. The long silence, the lack of speech, the strange behavior, all of it had been caused by something else. Then he mentioned the blood test. The chemicals found in Ethan's body were consistent with a strong sedative that, when taken regularly, could cause cognitive and motor delays. The medication hadn't been prescribed by any official doctor. It had been given to Ethan over years, likely by someone in the house. Grace's heart sank. Someone had made Ethan appear disabled on purpose. It wasn't a mistake. It had been intentional. But why would anyone do that to a child? Grace didn't sleep that night. She stayed up thinking about everything: the tapes, the diagnosis, the lies, the fake therapy, the strange behavior of Richard and Vanessa, and the mysterious missing document. It all had to be connected. Grace now understood that the truth was more dangerous than she thought. Ethan had been drugged for years to make him seem ill. Someone had gained something from that lie, maybe money, maybe sympathy, maybe power, and that document, the one Richard said had gone missing right before the court hearing, might contain the answer. Grace believed it. Maybe it was a medical report or proof of financial fraud. Whatever it was, it had to be the missing piece. She looked at Ethan, now asleep in bed, finally breathing freely. He had suffered so much in silence. She couldn't let it continue. She gently brushed his hair back and whispered, "I will find the truth, no matter what it takes." She wrote down everything she knew so far: names, dates, locations, even quotes from the tapes. She stored copies of the recordings in different places. One on a USB drive, another uploaded to a secure folder online. She didn't want to take any chances. She also contacted Dr. Hayes again and asked him to write an official report. He agreed, but warned her to be careful. Grace knew she was stepping into something bigger than just a family lie. She began asking questions about Richard's businesses, about the international fund, about court records. Most people didn't want to talk. Some even seemed nervous, but she didn't stop. Every clue brought her closer. She remembered Richard's office in the mansion, the locked drawer, the late-night meetings, and Vanessa's fear. The missing document was still out there. And now, Grace was determined to find it, for Ethan, for justice, and to finally stop those who had caused so much harm. It started on a quiet afternoon. Grace had returned to the house under the excuse of checking on Ethan's health. The court had allowed her supervised visits after Dr. Hayes' report. While pretending to play with some old toys in Ethan's room, Grace noticed something unusual in his behavior. Ethan kept glancing toward the corner of the room where an old wooden toy cabinet stood. It hadn't been touched in years. Grace stood up and opened it slowly. Inside were dusty dolls, puzzles, and stuffed animals, all tossed around carelessly. Ethan walked over without saying a word and pointed to a teddy bear on the top shelf. Its fur was torn on one side and stuffing peeked out from the opening. Grace pulled it down and checked it more closely. Then her heart stopped. Inside the ripped seam, hidden deep in the fluff, was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. It was the missing document. Ethan had kept it hidden all along. Grace could barely believe what she was holding. Her hands shook as she opened the paper carefully. It was exactly what everyone had been searching for. The confidential document Richard claimed had gone missing weeks ago. As her eyes scanned the text, she realized it was more than just a legal file. The paper included bank transactions, medical authorizations, and signatures. It revealed two things at once: the key to unlock a massive international research fund and proof that someone had been using Ethan's name to access it. There were names listed, and large sums of money traced to accounts that had nothing to do with Ethan's medical treatment. Grace looked at Ethan, who watched her closely, waiting for her reaction. He hadn't said a word, but he didn't need to. Grace finally understood. Ethan had seen more than anyone imagined. While the adults thought he was too quiet or too sick, he had been paying attention the whole time. Ethan had kept the truth safe in the only way he knew how, by hiding it. Grace felt proud, scared, and furious all at once. She hugged Ethan tightly and whispered, "You were so brave." Then she sat down and started reading the document in full. The numbers lined up with what Dr. Hayes had discovered. The medication wasn't for treatment. It was used to make Ethan seem ill. The money was supposed to go toward experimental therapy, but most of it had been moved into private accounts connected to shell companies. One of the companies was owned by someone linked to Vanessa. Another was tied to Richard's name through an investment fund. This wasn't just about a medical case anymore. It was fraud at a massive level. Grace understood that going public with this would destroy Richard and Vanessa, and now that she had the document, they would come after her. She had to act fast before they found out. Grace knew they couldn't stay in the house. She packed a small bag with clothes for Ethan, some water, snacks, and the most important item, the document. She placed it in a protective folder and sealed it inside a plastic zip pouch. Just as she zipped the backpack closed, she heard footsteps downstairs. Richard had returned early from a meeting. She froze. Quietly, she signaled to Ethan, and he nodded. He understood. She grabbed his hand and led him to the back exit near the laundry room. They slipped outside and moved quickly toward the garden gate. Grace's heart raced. She didn't look back. Once they reached the street, she called a taxi from her cell phone. She didn't explain much to the driver, only gave an address, a safe place near the courthouse where she could plan their next move. As the car drove away, Ethan looked out the window in silence. He knew things would never be the same again. In the safety of a small rented apartment, Grace and Ethan waited. She had already contacted Dr. Hayes and asked him to meet them in secret the next morning. He would help deliver the document to the court. They had only one chance. The final hearing was scheduled for the following day. If they failed to present the proof, the case would be closed, and the funds would be released under Richard and Vanessa's control. Grace reviewed the document over and over, checking the dates, signatures, and attachments. Ethan helped her by pointing to certain names he remembered hearing during those long nights of listening through the door. Grace was amazed at how sharp his memory was. Though he still didn't speak much, he was now fully aware of the situation. She could see it in his eyes. The fear, the courage, the understanding, all of it was there. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about truth and justice. By nightfall, Grace turned off all the lights and locked the door twice. She knew they were being hunted. Richard and Vanessa would soon realize the document was no longer hidden. They might even guess that Grace had it. But it didn't matter. Tomorrow was the final hearing. Everything would be decided then. Grace lay awake for hours, listening to every sound outside. Ethan slept next to her on the couch, holding the teddy bear, the same one that had kept the secret safe for so long. When morning finally came, they would go straight to the courthouse with Dr. Hayes. There, Grace would hand the document to the judge, exposing the fraud and saving Ethan from a lifetime of lies. There was no turning back now. Everything depended on what would happen in court. Grace closed her eyes, whispered a quiet promise to Ethan, and waited. They had the truth. All that was left was to show it. The courtroom was already full when the session started. Every seat was taken. Journalists, lawyers, social workers, and even a few curious onlookers had gathered early. The tension in the room was obvious. Richard sat in the front row beside Vanessa, both dressed in dark suits. Their expressions were serious and cold. Cameras were not allowed, but reporters scribbled notes quickly. Richard stood and walked toward the judge. His voice was strong and emotional. He told the court that Grace had kidnapped his son. He said Ethan was in danger and that Grace was an unstable ex-employee who had taken advantage of the child's condition. He claimed that she had faked documents and manipulated Ethan into running away. Vanessa stood up next, saying Grace had always shown signs of emotional instability. She said Grace had an obsession with the child and should not be trusted. Some people in the courtroom looked confused. Others nodded, unsure who to believe. Then everything changed. Just as Vanessa finished speaking, the large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Heads turned. Grace walked in calmly, holding Ethan's hand. She was dressed simply, without makeup or drama. Ethan wore a plain shirt and jeans. He looked straight ahead, focused. The room fell silent. The judge, clearly surprised, asked who had allowed them in. A security officer explained they were already on the approved visitor list. The judge looked directly at Grace, then down at Ethan. "Do you wish to speak?" he asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. He took one step forward, let go of Grace's hand, and said loudly, "My father is lying." The words echoed through the room. Everyone froze. For a long second, no one reacted. Then people started whispering. The judge banged his gavel and ordered silence. Ethan stood still, not scared, not crying, just serious. The boy who had never spoken in public had just told the truth, and no one was ready for it. Grace moved closer to the judge's table and placed a thick folder on it. She said the document inside was the one Richard had claimed was stolen. She also handed over Dr. Hayes's signed medical report. The judge signaled the bailiff to bring the papers forward. As he began to read, the courtroom remained silent. Grace explained in short, clear sentences. Ethan had been drugged with an unprescribed substance for years. The purpose was to make him appear sick, to justify the release of funds from a research account. She said Richard and Vanessa had used Ethan's medical condition to gain access to millions. Ethan nodded during her explanation, confirming her words. Then Grace added that the boy had hidden the original document in a toy bear because he knew no one else would protect him. Vanessa suddenly interrupted, shouting that it was all a setup. She tried to grab the folder, yelling that the court was being fooled. Chaos erupted. The judge quickly stood up and raised his voice. He ordered everyone to remain calm. When Vanessa kept yelling, ignoring direct warnings, the judge looked to security and said firmly, "Remove her from the courtroom. Charge her with contempt of court." Two officers approached Vanessa, who resisted briefly, but then followed them out, still shouting. Richard sat frozen. He didn't move or speak. He looked shocked, as if he hadn't expected Ethan to speak, or for Grace to show up with real proof. The judge ordered a break so that all documents could be reviewed in detail. The courtroom began to clear out, but the atmosphere was heavy. Reporters rushed outside to share the news. Ethan stayed beside Grace the entire time, holding her hand again. He looked tired, but also lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The judge announced that the hearing would continue later that day after a full review of the evidence now submitted. Outside the courtroom, things moved fast. News crews reported live. Headlines were being updated online. "Ethan speaks, the boy who exposed the truth," one headline read. Dr. Hayes arrived with additional documents, including lab results and comparison charts that proved the medication had never been approved for Ethan's condition. Legal assistants from the court reviewed everything. Inside a small waiting room, Grace, Ethan, and Dr. Hayes sat together. No one said much. They just waited. Ethan flipped through one of his drawings while Dr. Hayes watched the hallway for updates. Grace was exhausted, but she kept her focus. The moment was bigger than all of them now. It wasn't just about Ethan's future, it was about justice. Across the building, Richard was meeting with his legal team, now visibly shaken. Some of his lawyers had started to question his story. Vanessa was being questioned separately in a holding room. The court was preparing to make a decision, one that could change everything. By the time the hearing resumed, the judge had reviewed the full file. His face showed no emotion. Everyone returned to their seats. Grace sat behind the legal desk, with Ethan beside her. Dr. Hayes stood nearby, ready to testify if needed. The judge started by saying the evidence presented was strong and would require a deeper investigation. He confirmed that the document matched the missing file previously reported. He stated that Dr. Hayes's findings were consistent with long-term drug-induced symptoms, not a natural condition. He praised Ethan's courage and Grace's actions. Then he announced that a formal criminal inquiry would begin immediately. Richard was ordered to remain in the city under supervision. Vanessa would stay in custody. The courtroom erupted again, this time with reporters trying to get statements. But Ethan stayed quiet. He had said what he needed to say. For the first time, someone had listened. And now, the truth was finally out in the open. The official forensic report arrived 3 days after the final hearing. It was delivered to the courthouse under seal and opened in the presence of the judge, legal representatives, and Dr. Hayes. Grace sat beside Ethan in the courtroom, holding his hand tightly. As the judge read the contents out loud, the room became silent. The report confirmed that Ethan had been exposed to a specific set of chemical substances over a long period. These substances, when used regularly, caused temporary hearing loss and speech suppression. They were never meant for children and were not approved for medical use in any known therapy. The chemicals had been disguised as treatment, but in reality, they had been used to keep Ethan quiet and dependent. His condition had not been genetic or neurological. It had been induced. The judge looked up after reading the report. The truth was no longer a theory. It was confirmed. Ethan had been made sick on purpose. Next, the judge reviewed the document Ethan had hidden inside the teddy bear. It was examined by a financial fraud expert who confirmed its authenticity. The paper detailed the structure of the international fund that was supposedly created for rare medical cases, but it also revealed something much worse. The money was never directly managed by a medical institution. Instead, it was funneled through a fake company that appeared legitimate on paper. The investigation showed that this company was a shell corporation with no real staff or operations. Its only listed partner was a man who shared financial ties with Richard. The fund's money was supposed to support research, but most of it had been moved through accounts connected to Richard's business network. The plan had been simple. Use Ethan's false illness as a cover to unlock millions in aid, then redirect the money without raising suspicion. But with the document now in court, the entire scheme was exposed in detail. The judge then turned his attention to the audio recordings. One by one, they were played in the courtroom. Ethan sat quietly while the voices of Richard and Vanessa filled the speakers. In the recordings, Vanessa spoke about transferring funds before anyone asks questions. Richard was heard saying, "As long as the boy doesn't speak, we're safe." In another clip, Vanessa warned, "If this falls apart, we lose everything." The recordings made it impossible to deny their knowledge of the scheme. There were no signs of editing or manipulation in the audio files. Everything matched the timeline presented by Grace and Dr. Hayes. The judge paused after each recording, letting the courtroom absorb what had been said. There were no objections this time, no interruptions. The defense team remained silent, knowing there was nothing left to argue. What started as suspicion was now backed by physical evidence, medical reports, financial documents, and confessions caught on tape. The case had reached its breaking point. With the forensic report, the financial document, and the recordings all in place, the judge made his final decision. He stood, adjusted his glasses, and spoke clearly for everyone in the room to hear. Richard Campbell and Vanessa Moore were found guilty of fraud, child abuse, and attempted embezzlement of international funds. The courtroom remained quiet as the judge issued an order for their immediate arrest. Officers walked forward and placed handcuffs on both of them. Richard didn't resist. He stared at the floor, pale and expressionless. Vanessa tried to speak but was told to remain silent. The judge added that additional charges could follow as the investigation continued into Richard's business dealings. As they were taken away, Ethan watched silently. He didn't smile. He didn't speak, but his eyes followed them as they left the room. Grace placed her arm around him. The truth had been heard, and now the people who caused so much harm were finally being held accountable. As soon as the hearing ended, reporters rushed outside to broadcast the news. Headlines flashed on screens. billionaire and lawyer sentenced in abuse and fraud case. Inside the courthouse, officials began organizing protective services for Ethan. Social workers discussed placing him in a safe, stable environment. Grace, with the support of Dr. Hayes, asked for temporary guardianship. The judge agreed, stating that Ethan had already formed a trusted bond with her. More importantly, she had fought for him when no one else did. Grace knelt beside Ethan and told him, "It's over now. You're safe." Ethan nodded slowly. For the first time, the world knew what had happened to him. The lies were no longer protected by power or money. Justice had stepped in. The courtroom emptied, but Grace and Ethan stayed behind for a moment longer. He picked up the same teddy bear from earlier and hugged it. Not because it hid something anymore, but because now he didn't have to hide. Then quietly, tears rolled down Ethan's cheeks. But these tears weren't from fear or pain. They were from release. He had carried a secret for too long, one that no child should ever have to hold. Now, with the truth revealed and the people responsible punished, he could finally let go. Grace held him gently, allowing him to cry in peace. Dr. Hayes stood nearby, watching with quiet respect. No one rushed them. No one interrupted. It was a moment of healing. Outside, the world was reacting. Media, law enforcement, and financial investigators were now involved in unraveling everything Richard and Vanessa had done. But in that small courtroom, all that mattered was the boy who had once been silent. Ethan had spoken, and everything changed. The journey was not over, but it had turned a corner. A door had opened. Justice was no longer just a word. It was something Ethan had seen and felt for himself. After the trial ended and Richard and Vanessa were taken into custody, the court had one final issue to resolve: Ethan's future. With both biological parents now facing criminal charges and no other immediate family coming forward, the court had to decide who would take legal responsibility for the boy. Social workers held several meetings to evaluate the situation. In every session, one name kept coming up: Grace. She had been there through everything. From the beginning, she had cared for Ethan not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She had protected him when no one else did. Over the next few days, court-appointed psychologists and case managers spent time with both Grace and Ethan. They observed how they interacted, how Ethan responded to her presence, and how safe he felt when she was near. Their reports all came back with the same conclusion. The bond between Grace and Ethan was strong, stable, and clearly based on trust and love. The judge scheduled a final custody hearing. Grace sat in the courtroom, nervous but calm. Ethan was beside her, holding her hand. This time, the room was not packed with reporters or lawyers. It was a quiet hearing, with only a few legal officials present. The judge began by summarizing the reports from the Child Welfare Agency. He noted that multiple professionals had confirmed Ethan's emotional connection with Grace. He then turned directly to Ethan and asked if he had anything to say. Ethan looked up, nodded, and spoke clearly. "She is my real family," he said. The courtroom was silent. Grace's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time Ethan had ever spoken in a court without fear or hesitation. The judge leaned forward, smiled gently, and said he had heard enough. With a few strokes of his pen, he approved Grace's petition for legal guardianship. It was official. Grace was no longer just a caretaker. She was now his legal guardian. After the ruling, court staff met privately with Grace and explained the next steps. One important matter still had to be addressed: Ethan's financial future. Since Richard's assets were being seized as part of the criminal investigation, the judge wanted to ensure that Ethan would be protected. A portion of Richard's fortune, specifically the money that was supposed to go toward Ethan's medical treatment, would now be placed into a special trust. This trust would be managed under Ethan's name and only used for his benefit. The court chose Grace to act as the official trustee. Her role would be to protect the money, manage expenses for Ethan's care and education, and report regularly to the court to prevent any misuse. Grace agreed without hesitation. She wasn't interested in the money. Her only concern was Ethan's well-being. But knowing that he would now have resources for school, therapy, and a safe home gave her peace. Ethan had a future again, a real one. In the days that followed, the media exploded with the story. News outlets around the world picked up the headlines. Photos of Ethan walking hand in hand with Grace outside the courthouse appeared in newspapers and news apps. A picture of Ethan speaking during the final trial circulated online with the caption, "The boy who found his voice." The story spread quickly. A child thought to be mute had exposed a billionaire's fraud using his own words. Journalists from international media flew in, requesting interviews. Grace declined most of them, choosing to protect Ethan's privacy. But she allowed one brief interview with a trusted journalist, where she simply said, "He's not a case. He's not a victim. He's a boy who was brave enough to speak when it mattered most." That quote was printed on front pages everywhere. People called it a story of justice. Others called it a miracle. But for Grace and Ethan, it was something much simpler. It was the beginning of a new life. Meanwhile, Grace worked on creating a new routine. She moved with Ethan into a quiet neighborhood outside the city, away from the press and the chaos. The new house was small but warm. Ethan had his own room with shelves for books, toys, and space for drawing. Every morning, he had breakfast at the table. Every night, he went to sleep without fear. Grace enrolled him in a nearby school with special support for kids who had been through trauma. Therapists and teachers welcomed him with patience and care. At first, Ethan didn't talk much. But little by little, he started answering questions. He raised his hand. He laughed. He even made a few friends. Grace watched all of it with quiet pride. She helped with homework, went to parent meetings, and made sure Ethan had everything he needed. The trust fund covered his needs, but it was the emotional safety that made the real difference. For the first time, Ethan was just a child, not a headline, not a case, just himself. On the anniversary of the trial, a journalist sent a copy of the original newspaper to Grace with a note that read, "Thank you for changing the story." The headline still stood out in bold, "Boy once thought to be mute brings down billionaire with his voice." Grace looked at the paper, then folded it neatly and placed it in a box of keepsakes for Ethan. She didn't want him to grow up defined by what happened, but she also didn't want him to forget his strength. That night, she and Ethan had dinner together and watched one of his favorite movies. Before bed, he handed her a drawing he had made. It showed the two of them standing under a tree, holding hands. In the corner, he had written 2 words, "My family." Grace smiled and hugged him tight. Everything they had fought for was real now. Justice had been done. But more importantly, love had won. Several months had passed since the court decision. Life had changed completely for Ethan. For the first time in his life, things felt normal. He woke up each day in a quiet house, ate breakfast without rush, and packed his backpack for school. He attended classes regularly, sat with other children, and asked questions like any curious kid. He had grown more confident in speaking. Words came out naturally now. He no longer hesitated or looked around nervously. His teachers were amazed at how quickly he learned. He caught up on reading, solved math problems with ease, and even started helping classmates who struggled. During breaks, he played soccer with friends and laughed freely. Grace picked him up after school, and they always talked during the ride home. He shared stories about class, his favorite subjects, and even his new drawings. His silence had been replaced by a clear, strong voice, one that showed the world he was no longer afraid. At home, things were just as peaceful. Grace had created a routine that made Ethan feel safe. He had chores, homework time, and space for fun. But Grace also felt the need to do more. What happened to Ethan had opened her eyes to how many children suffered in silence, without anyone noticing. She decided to start an organization to help kids like him. After several meetings with lawyers, social workers, and psychologists, she officially launched the Voice Project. It was a center designed to protect children who had been neglected or abused. The team offered therapy, legal support, and a safe place for kids to recover. Grace named it after Ethan, not to expose his story again, but to honor the courage he showed. Ethan helped design the logo, a simple drawing of a child speaking into a microphone. People from all over the country supported the idea. Donations came in, volunteers signed up. The Voice Project had started small, but it was growing fast. News about the project spread quickly. Many remembered Ethan's story from the trial. The boy, who had once been believed to be mute, had become a symbol of truth and justice. Media outlets started revisiting the case. Articles were written, interviews were requested, and people discussed how the system had failed him and how he overcame it. Lawmakers began to pay attention. Some met with Grace to discuss policy changes. They reviewed how abuse cases were handled, especially when connected to powerful families. Within months, new proposals were drafted to improve child protection laws. One bill, called the Ethan Act, aimed to strengthen the process of reporting suspected abuse and give more authority to child welfare agencies to investigate private medical treatments. Grace didn't care about politics, but she was proud that Ethan's story was making a real difference. She kept her focus on the kids at the center. Every time she saw one of them smile or speak freely, she knew the fight had been worth it. As time went on, Ethan adjusted more and more to his new life. He visited the Voice Project often, sometimes to read books, sometimes just to play. Other children there looked up to him, even if they didn't fully know his past. He was patient with them. He listened. Sometimes he sat with a kid who didn't want to talk and just stayed nearby. Grace saw this and realized how much he had healed and how much he could help others heal too. One day, a filmmaker approached Grace with an idea, a documentary about the Voice Project and Ethan's journey. Grace hesitated at first. She didn't want to turn Ethan's life into a show, but after thinking carefully and after Ethan himself agreed, she allowed it, under the condition that the story be respectful and focused on hope. Filming began quietly, with Ethan speaking to the crew on his own terms. He chose what to share. He didn't want pity. He wanted people to understand the truth. The documentary was completed a few months later. It told Ethan's story from the beginning, the silence, the medicine, the courtroom, the moment he spoke, and everything that followed. It also showed how the Voice Project was helping others like him. The film included interviews with Grace, Dr. Hayes, and a few teachers who had seen Ethan's progress. It ended with scenes of children drawing, laughing, and learning at the center. When the film was released online and at a few small festivals, the reaction was strong. Viewers sent messages of support and thanks. Some told their own stories of childhood neglect or abuse. Others said they were inspired to get involved with child advocacy work. The documentary was even used in training programs for social workers and educators. But the most powerful moment came at the very end, when Ethan, now fully comfortable in front of a camera, looked straight ahead and said his final line, the same line he had written himself. In the final scene, Ethan stood in front of a simple white wall. He wore a plain blue shirt and held a small paper in his hand. The camera zoomed in slowly. His voice was steady, calm, and clear. "They wanted to silence me," he said, "but no one can silence the truth." The screen faded to black. That final sentence stayed in the minds of everyone who watched. It wasn't just a line, it was a message, a reminder that even the smallest voice could carry power, if it spoke the truth. Grace watched the film alone the first time. She cried, not because of sadness, but because of pride. She looked at the boy who had once been quiet and broken and saw someone strong, kind, and brave. Ethan went back to his normal life after the release. No fame, no spotlight, just school, friends, and helping others. But that one moment, that one sentence, became a symbol around the world. A voice, finally free. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.